The version of early America you were taught in school left out the parts that were complicated, uncomfortable, and sometimes brutal. Tonight, 100 of the secrets they buried, the real reason settlers came, the alliances that were made and broken, and the events that shaped this country before anyone was writing things down truthfully. This is Sleepy American History. Get comfortable and let's dig in.
What if I told you that the men who shaped the most powerful nation on earth were also, quietly, some of the strangest people who ever lived? That one of them kept a live alligator in a White House bathroom, that another carved a rescue message into a coconut, and it actually worked, and that a third spent his most consequential years in office genuinely afraid to touch a light switch? None of that is exaggerated. None of it is myth. Every single word is true, documented, and sitting in the historical record like it has always been there. Because it has. You are about to spend the next 2 hours learning the version of American history that the textbooks filed quietly in the back. Get comfortable. This is going to be a very good night. 1. The president who was terrified of becoming a king. So here's the thing about George Washington. The man genuinely lost sleep over the idea that Americans might try to crown him. Not as a metaphor. Literally. After the Revolutionary War ended, some military officers floated the idea of making Washington a monarch, and his response was about as warm as a January morning in Valley Forge. He shut it down immediately and wrote a letter calling the suggestion the most painful thing he had ever received. Washington had spent years fighting against a king. The last thing he wanted was to become one himself. When he was elected the first president, he was careful about every single title, every ceremony, every gesture, because he understood that whatever he did first would set the pattern for everyone who came after. He was essentially building the instruction manual in real time, with no draft copy and no second chances. That kind of quiet, deliberate pressure is something most people never think about. And yet, there he was, carrying it. Steadily, alone. 2. John Adams and the house that wasn't ready. There is something quietly funny about being the first person to live in the White House. And that something is this. It was absolutely not finished when John Adams moved in. Adams arrived at the executive mansion in November of 1800, and the building was still damp, drafty, and barely habitable. Only a handful of rooms were even remotely livable. The grand staircase had not been installed yet. Firewood was scarce. His wife Abigail, who joined him shortly after, famously used the unfinished east room to hang laundry because there was simply nowhere else. She wrote letters home describing the place with a kind of resigned good humor that suggests she had accepted her fate entirely. The mansion that would eventually become one of the most recognized buildings on Earth was, at that particular moment, essentially a very expensive construction site with a president inside it. Adams only lived there for a few months before losing re-election. He left before the laundry room got any better. 3. Thomas Jefferson's vanilla dilemma. Here's the thing about Thomas Jefferson. He may be responsible for introducing vanilla ice cream to America, or at least for writing down one of the earliest American recipes for it. Jefferson spent time in France as a diplomat during the 1780s and developed a deep appreciation for French cuisine, including a frozen dessert made with vanilla bean custard. He brought the recipe back to the U.S., and it appears in his own handwriting in his personal notes, 17 ingredients, hand-churned, probably served at Monticello to guests who had no idea they were eating something historically significant. Jefferson was obsessive about food and wine in a way that was genuinely unusual for his era. He kept meticulous records of what he grew, what he ate, and what he served. The man had a full-scale vegetable garden with over 330 varieties of vegetables and herbs. He was, so, in many respects, the founding father most likely to have had an opinion about your dinner. That vanilla ice cream recipe still exists today, archived and occasionally reproduced by food historians who confirm it is, in fact, delicious. 4. James Madison, the smallest giant in the room. You might not immediately picture James Madison as a towering figure, and here's the thing. That is because he literally was not one. Madison stood around 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed approximately 100 pounds for most of his adult life. He was, by almost every account, the smallest president in U.S. history. He was quiet, bookish, and frequently underestimated in person by people who had not yet heard him speak. But when Madison spoke in a room, whether at the Constitutional Convention or in Congress, people stopped what they were doing and listened. He was the primary architect of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, documents that have shaped the country for over 2 centuries. He did not achieve that by being loud. He achieved it by being relentlessly prepared. Madison showed up to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 with more research, more notes, and more proposed frameworks than almost anyone else in the room. Small in stature, enormous in preparation. So, the kind of person who makes you want to organize your notes before any important meeting. 5. James Monroe and the era of good feelings that were mostly good. So, here's the thing about James Monroe's presidency. It was known as the era of good feelings, which is one of the most optimistic names any period of history has ever received. And it was not entirely unearned. Monroe served 2 terms beginning in 1817, during a time when the Federalist Party had essentially collapsed, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the dominant political force. For a brief, unusual stretch of American history, there was very little organized partisan opposition. Monroe ran for re-election in 1820 and received every single electoral college vote except one. One elector from New Hampshire cast a vote for someone else, reportedly because he believed only Washington deserved a unanimous vote. Monroe was popular, the country was expanding, and the mood was, by historical standards, relatively calm. He also completed the acquisition of Florida from Spain and issued the Monroe Doctrine, warning European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. For a presidency remembered mostly by its pleasant nickname, it quietly accomplished quite a lot. Good feelings, as it turns out, can be genuinely productive. 6. John Quincy Adams and his morning skinny dipping habit. There is a very specific image that history hands you when it comes to John Quincy Adams. And here's the thing. It involves the Potomac River at 5 a.m. Adams had a well-documented habit of rising before dawn and swimming in the river, completely unclothed. He was disciplined almost to the point of absurdity. He kept a diary for over 60 years, recording his activities, his readings, his mood, and his daily exercise in meticulous detail. The skinny dipping was simply part of the routine. There is also a famous story, probably true but occasionally debated, that a reporter named Anne Royal knew about Adams' morning swim and used it to her advantage. Unable to secure an interview through traditional means, she reportedly sat on his clothes at the riverbank and refused to leave until he answered her questions. Whether or not every detail of that story holds up, what is certainly true is that Adams swam regularly, kept obsessive records of it, and was, by all measures, one of the most disciplined presidents to ever hold the office. 7. And Andrew Jackson's parrot problem. Andrew Jackson was many things. War hero, controversial president, deeply complicated historical figure. And here's the thing, he also owned a parrot. The bird's name was Polk, an African gray parrot that Jackson reportedly taught to speak. By most accounts, Polk was an impressive mimic. The problem emerged at Jackson's funeral in 1845, when, according to multiple witnesses present, the parrot had to be removed from the service. Polk had apparently learned some language that was entirely unsuitable for a solemn occasion, and began repeating it loudly at the wrong moment. The exact words were not recorded in polite historical documents, but the general implication is clear enough. Witnesses at the funeral noted the incident with a mixture of surprise and, in some cases, barely contained amusement. Jackson was gone, but his parrot was still, in some sense, making his presence known. It is one of those small, strange footnotes that history drops in your lap completely unannounced. A man of enormous historical consequence, remembered here briefly for his very badly behaved bird. 8. Martin Van Buren and the word that might be his fault. Here's the thing about Martin Van Buren. He may have accidentally given the English language one of its most enduring slang terms. Van Buren was born in Kinderhook, New York, and his political supporters nicknamed him Old Kinderhook during his 1840 presidential campaign. They formed clubs called OK Clubs in support of him, using his initials as a rallying symbol. Around the same time, the abbreviation OK began appearing in newspapers as shorthand for the phrase, all correct, with a jokey misspelling that was fashionable in the 1830s. The two uses appeared nearly simultaneously, and while historians still debate the exact origin, the Van Buren campaign almost certainly helped spread the term into mainstream use. Today, OK is considered one of the most widely used and globally recognized words in the English language, understood across cultures and languages around the world. Van Buren lost that 1840 re-election campaign to William Henry Harrison. But if the OK theory holds up, he accidentally left behind something far more lasting than a second term. Language has a way of doing that. 9. William Henry Harrison and the speech that sealed his fate. So here's the thing about William Henry Harrison. He gave the longest inaugural address in U.S. presidential history, and it may have contributed directly to his death. Harrison delivered his speech on March 4th, 1841, a cold and wet Washington morning. He spoke for approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes without a hat or coat, apparently to demonstrate his physical vigor at 68 years old. The speech was nearly 8,500 words long. He developed a cold shortly afterward, which progressed into pneumonia and pleurisy. 31 days later, he was dead. The shortest presidency in U.S. history. The exact medical chain of events has been debated by historians, with some suggesting his illness may have had other contributing factors, including contaminated water at the White House. But the image remains, a man so determined to appear strong that he stood in the cold for nearly 2 hours, making the longest speech anyone had ever delivered at an inauguration. History has a gentle way of reminding us that sometimes less really is more. 10. John Tyler. The president nobody wanted. Here's the thing about John Tyler. Almost nobody wanted him in charge, and he knew it. Tyler was Harrison's vice president, elected on the Whig Party ticket in 1840. When Harrison died just 31 days into office, Tyler became president, and it quickly became clear that Tyler and the Whigs disagreed on essentially everything. The Whig Party, which had just won the White House, vetoed their own president's legislation repeatedly. In return, Tyler vetoed most of what Congress sent him. His entire cabinet resigned except one member. The Whig Party officially expelled him. While he was still president, he became known as a man without a party, leading a country that was not entirely sure how to feel about him being there. And yet Tyler served out his full term, established the constitutional precedent that a vice president becomes a full president upon succession, not merely an acting president, and did so without flinching. The man was stubborn in a way that quietly shaped history. If you are still awake and enjoying these little corners of the past, consider hitting subscribe so more of this finds its way to you. Now, on to the next. 11. James K. Polk and the Presidency. He promised to leave. There is something quietly remarkable about a person who promises, before taking office exactly how long they plan to stay. And here's the thing. James K. Polk did exactly that. When Polk ran for president in 1844, he was something of a surprise candidate, not widely known nationally before his nomination. But he ran on a clear, specific platform and made a private commitment to serve only one term. He kept that promise. In 4 years, Polk accomplished an astonishing amount. He oversaw the acquisition of the Oregon Territory through negotiation with Britain, the annexation of Texas, and the Mexican-American War, which added California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states to the U.S. He also reorganized the Treasury system and worked an absolutely punishing schedule. By most historical accounts, Polk was one of the hardest working presidents the country has ever seen. He left office in 1849, exhausted and in declining health. He died just 3 months after his presidency ended. He had worked himself quietly and deliberately into the history books. 12. Zachary Taylor and the Mystery of the Cherries. So, here's the thing about Zachary Taylor. He was a decorated war general who survived some of the most brutal military campaigns in early American history, and then died after eating cherries and drinking cold milk at a 4th of July celebration. That is not a metaphor. On July the 4th, 1850, Taylor attended a long outdoor ceremony in Washington during an intense summer heat. He consumed a large quantity of cherries, cold milk, and possibly iced water and other foods. Within days, he developed severe gastrointestinal illness. 5 days later, he was dead, having served only 16 months in office. The official cause was gastroenteritis, an acute inflammation of the stomach and intestines. In 1891, conspiracy theories about possible poisoning prompted an exhumation of his remains, but tests found no evidence of arsenic or foul play. The cherries and cold milk, consumed on a hot day after hours in the sun, appear to have simply done their quiet damage. Taylor had survived battlefield wounds and years of frontier warfare. History apparently had other plans. 13. Millard Fillmore and the bathtub hoax. Here's the thing about Millard Fillmore. He is perhaps most famous for something he almost certainly did not do. For decades, a widely repeated story claimed that Fillmore installed the first bathtub in the White House. The story appeared in newspapers, history books, and general trivia collections with the kind of confidence that only completely false information can muster. It was, in fact, entirely fabricated by journalist H.L. Mencken in 1917 as a deliberate experiment in how easily misinformation spreads. Mencken later admitted he made it up. But the bathtub story kept circulating anyway, because it was charming and specific and felt true. Fillmore's actual presidency, from 1850 to 1853, involved genuinely significant events, including the Compromise of 1850, which attempted to ease tensions between northern and southern states over the question of slavery. Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act as part of that compromise, a decision historians continue to examine carefully. The bathtub myth, meanwhile, refuses to quietly disappear, which, in its own way, says something interesting about the things we choose to remember. 14. Franklin Pierce and the weight of personal loss. There is a kind of sadness threaded through Franklin Pierce's presidency that most history books do not linger on. And here's the thing. It shaped everything. Pierce and his wife, Jane, had 3 sons, all of whom died in childhood. Their youngest, Benjamin, known as Benny, was 11 years old when he was killed in a train accident, just 2 months before Pierce's inauguration in 1853. Pierce and his wife witnessed the accident. Jane Pierce, who had opposed her husband's political ambitions and reportedly fainted when she learned he had been nominated, was so overwhelmed by grief that she did not attend the inauguration. She spent much of the early presidency in seclusion, writing letters to her son. Pierce entered the White House carrying a weight that no ceremony or title could soften. His presidency was marked by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which intensified national divisions over slavery. Historians often assess his term critically. But behind the political record was a man navigating unimaginable personal loss while trying to lead a fracturing nation. History rarely pauses long enough to sit with that quietly. 15. James Buchanan, America's only bachelor president. So here's the thing about James Buchanan. He was the only U.S. president to never marry. He served from 1857 to 1861 and lived his entire adult life as a bachelor, which in the 19th century was unusual enough to attract regular commentary. Buchanan had been engaged once, to a woman named Anne Coleman in 1819, but the engagement ended and she died shortly afterward at a young age. Buchanan was reportedly devastated and never pursued another serious relationship. During his years in Washington before the presidency, he shared a home with Alabama Senator William Rufus Devane King for over a decade, and their close friendship prompted considerable gossip at the time. Historians have written extensively about the nature of their relationship, though firm conclusions remain a matter of debate. For his entire term. His niece Harriet for his entire term. His niece Harriet Lane served as White House hostess and was, by most accounts, charming, capable, and far more popular than her uncle's presidency ever managed to be. 16. Abraham Lincoln and the hat that did extra work. Here's the thing about Abraham Lincoln's hat. It was not just a hat. Lincoln stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, which made him the tallest president in U.S. history. He wore a stovepipe hat that added several more inches to that height, making him genuinely towering in any room he entered. But the hat also served a practical function. Lincoln used the inside of his hat as a portable filing system. He kept letters, documents, notes, and important papers tucked inside the lining, retrieving them as needed. For a man who famously worked without a large formal staff and managed enormous political correspondence largely on his own terms, the hat was essentially a mobile office. Lincoln had very little formal education, less than a year of organized schooling by most estimates, and taught himself law by reading borrowed books. He practiced in rural Illinois before entering national politics, and that habit of improvised, self-sufficient organization never entirely left him. So, the stovepipe hat is one of history's more charming images. Iconic, immediately recognizable, and quietly functional in a way most people never consider. 17. Andrew Johnson and the tailor who never stopped. So, here's the thing about Andrew Johnson. Before he was president, he was a tailor, and he never stopped being proud of it. Johnson grew up in poverty in North Carolina and had almost no formal schooling. He was apprenticed to a tailor as a child and learned the trade thoroughly. Even after he entered politics and eventually became president, following Lincoln's assassination in 1865, he continued to make his own clothes on occasion and spoke openly about his background as a craftsman. Johnson reportedly took pride in reminding people where he came from, seeing it as evidence of self-made determination rather than something to be embarrassed about. His presidency was turbulent. He clashed constantly with Congress over Reconstruction policy following the Civil War and became the first U.S. president to be impeached in 1868. He was acquitted by a single vote in the Senate. Through all of it, the former tailor from North Carolina remained a figure defined as much by where he started as by where he ended up. There is something to be said for that kind of stubbornness. 18. Ulysses S. R. Grant and the speeding ticket. Here's the thing about Ulysses S. Grant. He received what is widely considered the first speeding ticket issued to a sitting U.S. president. Grant was an enthusiastic horseman who enjoyed driving his horse and carriage through the streets of Washington with a speed that was, by all accounts, not appropriate for a residential area. On at least one occasion, a police officer stopped him for driving too fast. Grant reportedly accepted the citation, paid the fine, and walked the rest of the way home after his horse and carriage were temporarily held. The officer, a man named William West, was apparently unintimidated by the fact that the man holding the reins was the President of the United States. Grant, to his credit, did not make a scene about it. The incident is often cited as an early example of the principle that no one is entirely above the law, even the person living in the biggest house in the country. Grant's presidency had its share of serious controversies and political scandals, but the speeding ticket remains one of history's more quietly charming footnotes. Accountability, it turns out, can arrive from unexpected directions. 19. Rutherford B. Hayes and the Lemonade White House. So here's the thing about Rutherford B. Hayes. His White House was famously and deliberately dry. Hayes and his wife Lucy were committed temperance advocates, meaning they did not serve alcohol at White House events during his presidency from 1877 to 1881. This was a significant departure from standard practice, and it made a considerable impression on Washington's social scene, which had very much come to expect wine at formal dinners. Lucy Hayes, who was college-educated at a time when that was genuinely uncommon for women, became the target of the nickname Lemonade Lucy, Russ, though this nickname may actually have circulated more after her time than during it. The policy was occasionally mocked in political circles, but it also earned the Hayes' admiration from temperance supporters across the country. Hayes was also the first president to have a telephone installed in the White House, a gift from Alexander Graham Bell himself. He reportedly used it to call the inventor personally. The first recorded message was something appropriately ordinary for a man that careful and deliberate, which is oddly fitting for a president history often passes right by without stopping. 20. James Garfield and the ambidextrous trick. Here's the thing about James Garfield. He could write in Latin with one hand and ancient Greek with the other simultaneously. This is not an exaggeration. Garfield was genuinely ambidextrous and reportedly delighted in demonstrating the trick at social gatherings, writing 2 different classical languages in 2 different hands at the same time. He was a former college president, a classics scholar, and one of the most intellectually accomplished people to ever hold the office. He taught himself Greek and Latin, was deeply interested in mathematics, and entered the presidency in 1881 with an intellectual curiosity that was evident in almost everything he did. Garfield's presidency lasted only 200 days. He was shot by an assassin in July of 1881 and died in September of that year, with many historians now noting that aggressive and unsanitary medical treatment may have been as significant as the wound itself in causing his death. He is remembered partly for the tragedy of what was cut short. But for a moment, in a quiet parlor somewhere, there was a president writing in 2 ancient languages at once. And that at least is a lovely thing to fall asleep thinking about. 20 facts in, and if you are still with us, that is genuinely impressive. Your eyes are probably doing that slow, heavy thing now. That pleasant drift where the words start to blur at the edges just slightly. That is good. That means it is working. We've got 80 more presidents and secrets to go, and every single one of them is true. Rest easy. We are just getting started. 21. Chester Arthur and the wardrobe that ran the country. There is a particular kind of person who takes clothing seriously enough to make it a form of governance, and here's the thing about Chester Arthur. He was absolutely that person. Arthur succeeded Garfield after his death in 1881 and arrived at the presidency with a reputation as a political machine insider. What almost nobody expected was the wardrobe. Arthur owned over 80 suits and was known to change his outfit multiple times a day. He reportedly refused to get dressed until well into the afternoon, conducting early morning business in his quarters while Washington waited. He had his pants tailored to a specific break over the shoe, and he cared about the cut of a lapel the way most men cared about interest rates. Washington's socialites were quietly stunned. The man they expected to be a backroom operator turned out to be something closer to a dandy with a conscience. He also surprised nearly everyone by supporting civil service reform, pushing for a merit-based federal hiring system rather than the patronage appointments he had once benefited from. The suit stayed. The political machine gradually did not. 22. Sir Grover Cleveland and the veto machine. So, here's the thing about Grover Cleveland. He vetoed more bills during his first term than all previous presidents combined. That is not a loose approximation. Cleveland served his first term from 1885 to 1889 and issued over 400 vetoes in 4 years, compared to roughly 200 total vetoes from every president before him. He read every bill personally. He did not delegate that task to staff or advisors. He sat with each piece of legislation and made his own judgment, and if he found it wasteful, fraudulent, or constitutionally questionable, he rejected it, including hundreds of private pension bills that he believed were either exaggerated or outright dishonest. Congress passed them anyway on override in some cases, but Cleveland kept going. His approach was methodical, slightly stubborn, and almost obsessively principled. He was also the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, losing in 1888 and winning again in 1892, making him both the 22nd and 24th president. Most people do not realize that the number jumps for a reason. Cleveland is technically 2 entries in the official count. 23. Benjamin Harrison and the electric light. He would not touch. Here's the thing about Benjamin Harrison. Electricity came to the White House during his presidency, and he was genuinely afraid to touch the light switches. Electric lighting was installed in the Executive Mansion in 1891, a novelty that most people found thrilling, and Harrison found slightly terrifying. He and his wife, Caroline, reportedly refused to operate the switches themselves out of concern about electric shock, preferring to leave lights on through the night rather than risk touching them to turn them off. White House staff would turn the lights on and off on their behalf. This was not entirely irrational for the era. Electricity was new, poorly understood by the general public, and electrical accidents were genuinely not uncommon. Harrison was cautious in the way that thoughtful people are cautious about things they do not fully understand. His wife, Caroline, meanwhile, was a talented artist who painted china and oversaw significant renovations to the White House. She also advocated for women to be admitted to Johns Hopkins University as a condition of the Harrison family's financial support. A man afraid of light switches, married to a woman quietly pushing higher education forward. History is full of contrasts. 24. Grover Cleveland. Again, because he earned a second chapter. So here's the thing about Grover Cleveland's second term. It began with a secret surgery performed on a yacht. Cleveland won back the presidency in 1892 and almost immediately discovered a malignant tumor on the roof of his mouth. Concerned that news of a seriously ill president would worsen an already fragile economy, during the Panic of 1893, Cleveland arranged for the operation to be performed in complete secrecy. In July of 1893, he boarded a friend's yacht called the Oneida on the East River and underwent surgery while the vessel was at sea. Besides, surgeons removed a large portion of his upper jaw and fitted him with a prosthetic made of vulcanized rubber. Cleveland returned to public life appearing entirely normal. The operation was not publicly confirmed until 1897, and the full details were not widely known until a medical account was published in 1917, 9 years after Cleveland's death. The economy struggled through his second term regardless, but the man himself kept the secret so thoroughly that most of Washington had no idea their president had been quietly rebuilt on a boat. 25. William McKinley and the Lucky Carnation. There is something quietly tender about a superstition that involves a flower. And here's the thing about William McKinley. He wore a red carnation in his lapel every single day as a good luck charm. McKinley was the 25th president, serving from 1897 until his assassination in 1901. and the carnation was a constant. He gave them away regularly to friends, admirers, and visitors as tokens of goodwill. In September of 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley was greeting a long line of visitors. At some point during the event, he gave away his carnation to a young girl in the crowd. Shortly afterward, he was shot by an assassin. He died 8 days later. The detail of the carnation, given away just moments before the attack, became one of those quietly haunting footnotes that history carries without quite knowing what to do with. McKinley was known as a warm and approachable president, someone who genuinely liked meeting people. That instinct, generous to the last, is what made the moment possible. And somehow that is the part that stays with you. 26. Theodore Roosevelt and the speech he finished while bleeding. So here's the thing about Theodore Roosevelt. He was shot in the chest while on his way to give a campaign speech in Milwaukee in 1912, and he gave the speech anyway. The bullet was slowed by his steel eyeglass case and the folded 50-page speech manuscript he was carrying in his breast pocket. Doctors determined the bullet had lodged in his chest muscle and was not immediately life-threatening. Roosevelt, who had some medical knowledge and recognized he was not coughing blood, concluded correctly that his lung had not been punctured. He reportedly told his aides he would not be going to a hospital until after the speech. He spoke for approximately 90 minutes. He began by showing the audience his bloody shirt. The speech covered his political platform with the same energy he brought to everything else. He was eventually taken to a hospital, where doctors decided the bullet was safer left in place. It stayed there for the rest of his life. Roosevelt was 53 years old at the time, running as the Progressive Party candidate. He lost that election, but he delivered that speech, and that, in some form, seems to be exactly what he would have wanted. 27. William Howard Taft and the bathtub that actually existed. Here's the thing about the White House bathtub. After the Millard Fillmore myth we covered earlier, the actual bathtub story worth telling belongs to William Howard Taft. Taft was a large man, standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 300 pounds during much of his presidency. The standard White House bathtub was simply not designed to accommodate him comfortably, and after one reportedly notable incident, a new tub was ordered. The replacement was enormous, large enough to hold 4 average-sized men, according to accounts from the time. Taft served as the 27th president from 1909 to 1913 and remains one of the most physically distinctive figures in the history of the office. But here is the more interesting footnote about Taft. He later served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person in U.S. history to have held both the presidency and the nation's highest judicial position. He reportedly said the Chief Justiceship was the role he had always wanted more than the presidency, and if the White House bathtub situation told him anything, it was probably that some fits are better than others. 28. Woodrow Wilson and the sheep on the lawn. So, here's the thing about Woodrow Wilson's White House lawn during World War I. It was being maintained by a flock of sheep. This is completely true. After the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Wilson allowed a flock of sheep to graze on the White House grounds as a wartime efficiency measure. The idea was practical. The sheep kept the grass trimmed without requiring the labor of groundskeepers, who could be freed up for other work. There were approximately 18 sheep in the flock. They did their job with complete indifference to their surroundings. One of the rams, named Old Ike, reportedly developed a taste for tobacco and would chew on cigars discarded by White House visitors. True, the wool from the flock was sheared and auctioned off in each state to raise money for the Red Cross, reportedly bringing in over $100,000. The sheep were eventually removed after the war. The White House lawn returned to its conventional sheep-free state. But for a few years, during one of the most consequential conflicts in human history, the most famous yard in America was managed entirely by livestock, which is either brilliant or deeply surreal, depending on how awake you currently are. 29. Warren G. Harding and the Poker Debt, that cost the country. Here's the thing about Warren G. Harding. He was an enthusiastic poker player, and on one occasion, he reportedly bet the entire White House china collection in a game and lost. This story has circulated widely and has some historical backing, though the precise details vary by source. What is more thoroughly documented is that Harding's presidency was surrounded by extraordinary corruption, much of it originating from people he trusted. The Teapot Dome scandal, which emerged after his death in 1923, revealed that his Secretary of the Interior had accepted bribes to lease federal oil reserves to private companies at below market rates. It became one of the most significant political corruption scandals in American history up to that point. Harding himself was not directly implicated in the worst of it, and he died in office before the full scope became public. He was genuinely popular with ordinary Americans during his lifetime, affable, warm, and easy to like. The poker story, real or embellished, fits something true about him. He trusted people he should not have. And in Washington, that kind of loyalty tends to get expensive. 30. Calvin Coolidge and the Mechanical Horse. So, here's the thing about Calvin Coolidge. He had a mechanical horse installed in the White House, and he rode it every morning. Coolidge was not a physically active man in the traditional sense. He did not hike or hunt or box the way some of his predecessors had, but he had been advised that some form of exercise was necessary, and he took that advice in the most efficient, low-drama way he could imagine, a contraption that simulated horseback riding without requiring an actual horse, actual outdoors, or actual effort beyond sitting and holding on. He used it daily. Coolidge was famously a man of very few words. He earned the nickname Silent Cal for a reason. A story, possibly apocryphal but widely told, claims that a dinner guest once bet a friend she could get more than 2 words out of him. She told the president about the bet. Coolidge reportedly replied, "You lose." Whether or not the exact exchange happened, it captures something real about the man. He was direct, quiet, and entirely unbothered by the impression that made. The mechanical horse ridden in private every morning fits him perfectly. Efficient, solitary, exactly as much as was necessary. 31. Herbert Hoover and the medicine ball cabinet. Here's the thing about Herbert Hoover's morning exercise routine. It involved a large medicine ball and a group of men he called the medicine ball cabinet. Hoover served as president from 1929 to 1933 and began each morning with a vigorous game on the South Lawn involving a heavy ball that players threw over a volleyball net, mixing elements of volleyball and catch into a fast-paced workout. He played with a rotating group of friends, cabinet members, and associates who were willing to arrive at the White House before breakfast. The game was called Hoover Ball and had actual rules. It burned more calories than tennis, according to his physician. Hoover was deeply serious about the routine and rarely missed a session even during difficult periods. His presidency coincided with the beginning of the Great Depression, one of the most devastating economic crises in American history. And the gap between those early morning games and what was unfolding across the country is one of those quiet historical contrasts that is hard to look away from. He was not an unfeeling man. He was, by many accounts, someone genuinely struggling to find answers. The medicine ball, perhaps, was where he went to think. 32. Franklin D. Roosevelt and the dog who got more mail. So here's the thing about Franklin Roosevelt's Scottish Terrier. The dog once caused an international incident, or something very close to one. The dog's name was Fala, a gift given to Roosevelt in 1940, and the two became inseparable. Fala traveled with the president, appeared in photographs, and became genuinely famous in his own right. During the 1944 presidential campaign, Roosevelt's opponents circulated a story claiming Fala had been accidentally left behind on the Aleutian Islands, and that Roosevelt had sent a naval destroyer at enormous public expense to retrieve him. It was not true. Roosevelt addressed it directly in a speech, noting with dry amusement that Falla's Scottish soul had been deeply wounded by the accusation. The audience laughed. The speech is remembered as one of the more effective political moments of Roosevelt's long career. A president using his dog's fictitious indignation to defuse an attack. After Roosevelt's death in 1945, Falla reportedly waited for him at the front door for weeks. There is a statue of Roosevelt at his memorial in Washington. Falla's there too, cast in bronze, sitting beside him, which is entirely appropriate. 33. Harry Truman and the piano at 2 a.m. Here's the thing about Harry Truman. He was a genuinely accomplished pianist who practiced every morning and occasionally played in the middle of the night when he could not sleep. Truman had studied piano seriously as a child in Missouri and maintained the habit his entire life. See, he was good enough that some who heard him suggested he might have pursued music professionally had history taken a different course. He played everything from Mozart to Paderewski, and he played with real feeling, not just technical competence. During his time in the White House from 1945 to 1953, he was known to sit at the piano late at night when the pressures of office became too heavy to carry quietly into sleep. He made some of the most consequential decisions in modern American history, including the use of atomic weapons to end World War II and the decision to intervene in Korea. In between those decisions, there was a man in a quiet room, in the middle of the night, playing the piano. History tends to give you the decisions. It rarely gives you the music. But the music was there too. 34. Dwight D., Eisenhower, and the Pudding Green. So, here's the thing about Dwight Eisenhower. He loved golf so much that he had a putting green installed on the White House lawn, and he played on it almost every day. Eisenhower was the 34th president, serving from 1953 to 1961, and his passion for golf was so well known that it became almost a defining characteristic of his public image. He played over 800 rounds during his presidency. He kept score meticulously. He played at Augusta National in Georgia regularly and had a cabin there named after him. Critics occasionally used the golf as a symbol of disengagement, suggesting Eisenhower was more comfortable on the fairway than in the Situation Room. Supporters pointed to his extraordinary military career commanding Allied forces in Europe during World War II as evidence that no one should question his capacity for serious work. Eisenhower himself seemed unconcerned with the debate. He played golf because he found it genuinely restorative, and because, after a life spent managing the largest military operation in history, he had perhaps earned the right to choose his own way of resting. The Pudding Green is still there on the White House grounds today. A small, quiet legacy. 35. John F. Kennedy and the coconut that saved his life. Here's the thing about John F. Kennedy. During World War II, he was stranded on a Pacific island after his patrol torpedo boat was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer. Kennedy, then a young Navy lieutenant, helped rescue injured crew members and swam for hours in open water. When he eventually reached a small island with survivors, he needed to get a message to Allied forces without a radio. He carved a message into the shell of a coconut, asking for rescue, and sent it with local islanders who were willing to help. The coconut worked. A rescue team found them. Kennedy kept that coconut shell for the rest of his life, had it encased in plastic, and used it as a paperweight on the Oval Office desk when he became president. It sat there throughout his presidency, a piece of Pacific driftwood that had once been the difference between rescue and nothing. Kennedy was the 35th president, serving from 1961 until his assassination in 1963. Of all the objects that have ever sat on a president's desk, the coconut paperweight might be the one with the most to say about who the man was before the title ever arrived. 36. Lyndon B. Johnson and the shower with opinions. So here's the thing about Lyndon B. Johnson. He had a custom shower installed in the White House, with multiple heads set at different heights and pressures, and he took the design of that shower extremely seriously. Johnson was a large, physically expressive man who apparently found standard plumbing philosophically insufficient. The shower he commissioned had jets that could be adjusted individually, and he reportedly gave very specific instructions about where each head should be positioned and with what force. Former aides and White House staff described the shower with a combination of awe and exhaustion, suggesting the president had the same energy about bathroom fixtures as he had about legislation. Johnson was the 36th president and oversaw the passage of landmark civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act, and sweeping social programs under the Great Society Initiative. He was known for his intense, close-range conversational style, a tactic so effective it became known as the Johnson treatment, a combination of physical proximity, eye contact, and personal pressure that very few people could resist. He brought the same force of personality to everything he did, including, apparently the plumbing. 37. Richard Nixon and the bowling alley at midnight. Here's the thing about Richard Nixon. He was an avid bowler who had a single-lane bowling alley installed beneath the White House driveway, and he used it regularly, often late at night. Nixon was the 37th president, serving from 1969 until his resignation in 1974, and bowling was one of his genuine private pleasures. He was not a particularly gifted athlete in most respects, but he was a dedicated bowler who found the repetition and focus of the game genuinely calming. He would sometimes bowl alone after the rest of the building had gone quiet, which is an image both solitary and strangely human. Nixon's presidency included the historic opening of diplomatic relations with China, the Apollo moon landings occurring during his first term, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, alongside the Watergate scandal which ended his time in office. The bowling alley, meanwhile, remained. It was originally installed by Richard Nixon, used by subsequent presidents, and is still operational today somewhere beneath the North Portico. A quiet lane in a quiet place, built by a complicated man who needed somewhere to put his mind at rest. 38. Gerald Ford and the accidental moment that defined him. So here's the thing about Gerald Ford. He was an exceptionally accomplished athlete who was once offered contracts by 2 NFL teams, and yet history remembered him primarily for stumbling. Ford was a standout football player at the University of Michigan in the 1930s, good enough that both the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers expressed serious interest in signing him. He declined to pursue professional football and went to Yale Law School instead. As president from 1974 to 1977, he was never elected to the position, prior to having been appointed vice president and then ascending after Nixon's resignation. He was fit, coordinated, and athletic. But after he slipped on rain-slick steps descending from Air Force One in Salzburg, Austria in 1975, the stumble became the story. Comedian Chevy Chase built an entire recurring impression around the moment on the new television show Saturday Night Live. Ford, to his enormous credit, showed up at the White House Correspondents' Dinner and opened with a pratfall of his own, falling deliberately into the podium. The crowd loved it. A man secure enough to laugh at himself is, in hindsight, a fairly rare thing. 39. Jimmy Carter and the UFO report he filed. Here's the thing about Jimmy Carter. He filed an official report with the International UFO Bureau after witnessing something unusual in the sky over Leary, Georgia in 1969. So, while waiting to give a speech at a Lions Club meeting, Carter described seeing a bright object that changed color and seemed to move before disappearing. He submitted the report in 1973, by which point the sighting had been several years in the past, but was still clear in his memory. Carter was not someone given to exaggeration or sensationalism. He was a former naval officer, a nuclear engineer, and a Sunday school teacher who became the 39th president. He reportedly told people later that He believed what he saw was probably some kind of natural or meteorological phenomenon and not extraterrestrial in origin, and he did not pursue the subject as president the way some had hoped. But the report exists, filed under his name, sitting quietly in archives alongside whatever else 1969 was keeping to itself. Carter was a remarkably private and sincere man. The UFO report is one of those small, surprising details that makes him feel, paradoxically, even more grounded. 40. Ronald Reagan and the jelly beans. So here's the thing about Ronald Reagan and jelly beans. The relationship was genuine, long-standing, and almost presidential in its own right. Reagan had taken up eating jelly beans in the 1960s as a way to help himself quit smoking, and the habit stuck with him all the way to the White House. His preferred flavor was licorice, and the Jelly Belly Company created a blueberry flavor specifically to give Reagan a red, white, and blue mix for his inauguration. Jelly beans were placed in jars throughout the West Wing on Air Force One and in the Cabinet Room. Reagan offered them to visitors, foreign dignitaries, and members of Congress with the same ease that other hosts offer coffee. Astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1983 were surprised to find jelly beans in their supplies, sent along by the president. Reagan was the 40th president, serving 2 full terms from 1981 to 1989. His presidency is one of the most debated and analyzed in modern American history. But the jelly beans, purely simply personally his, are one of those details that feel like a direct line to the human being underneath the history. 40 facts down, and if your eyes are still open, you are doing better than most. That quiet, drifting heaviness in your chest right now, that is not boredom. That is your brain gently filing away true things for safekeeping. We have got 60 more to go, and every single one of them is worth staying just a little bit awake for. Settle in. The next chapter is already waiting. 41. George H.W. on Bush and the vegetable he banned. There is a particular kind of authority that comes with the presidency, and here's the thing about George H.W. Bush. He used some of that authority to formally ban broccoli from Air Force One. Bush was the 41st president, serving from 1989 to 1993, and his distaste for broccoli was deep, personal, and entirely non-negotiable. He announced publicly that he had disliked it since childhood, that his mother had made him eat it anyway, and that as the most powerful man in America, he no longer had to. The broccoli industry was not amused. California broccoli growers sent 10 tons of the vegetable to Washington in protest. Bush held firm. The episode became one of the more charming footnotes of his presidency, a man of considerable diplomatic restraint, drawing a surprisingly firm line at a cruciferous vegetable. Some hills apparently are worth standing on, even the green, slightly bitter ones. 42. Bill Clinton and the saxophone on late-night television. So here's the thing about Bill Clinton. Before he was president, he appeared on late-night television wearing sunglasses and played the saxophone, and it worked. Clinton was running for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1992 when he appeared on the Arsenio Hall show, put on a pair of Ray-Bans, and played Heartbreak Hotel with the house band. The moment was widely credited with helping humanize him to younger voters at a time when his campaign badly needed momentum. Clinton had played saxophone since childhood and was genuinely skilled, not performing for the cameras, but actually playing. He was the 42nd president, serving 2 full terms from 1993 to 2001. The saxophone appearance remains one of the more unusual pivots in modern campaign history. A candidate, a late-night stage, a borrowed spotlight. Sometimes the most effective political move is simply being recognizably, honestly yourself. 43. George W. Bush and the pretzel incident. Here's the thing about George W. Bush. In January of 2002, he briefly lost consciousness overdose while watching a football game in the White House residence after choking on a pretzel. He fainted, fell from the couch, and woke up on the floor with his two dogs, Barney and Spot, nearby. So he had a bruise on his cheek and a small scrape on his lip from the fall. The incident was confirmed by the White House physician and reported publicly. Bush was examined and cleared. He later showed reporters the bruise with characteristic ease and joked about the episode himself. Bush was the 43rd president, serving from 2001 to 2009, a tenure defined by September 11, 2 wars, and Hurricane Katrina. Against all of that historical weight, the pretzel story remains one of those surprisingly human moments. A reminder that even the most consequential lives include Tuesday evenings and snacks gone slightly wrong. 44, Barack Obama and the comic book collection. So here's the thing about Barack Obama. He collected Spider-Man and Conan the Barbarian comic books as a child growing up in Hawaii and Indonesia, and the hobby stuck with him long enough that Marvel Comics honored it directly. When Obama was elected the 44th president in 2008, Marvel published a special edition of The Amazing Spider-Man featuring Obama on the cover and included a backup story in which he appeared alongside the superhero. Obama's connection to the comics was genuine. He had spoken about his childhood reading habits in interviews before the tribute ever existed. He was also the first sitting U.S. president to appear in a Marvel comic book. So, Obama served 2 terms from 2009 to 2017. The comic book details the kind of thing that gets footnoted but deserves a little more room. A kid reading Spider-Man in Honolulu decades before anyone knew what was coming. 45. Donald Trump and the Cameo Collection. Here's the thing about Donald Trump. Before becoming the 45th president, he accumulated one of the more unusual cameo careers in modern entertainment history. Trump appeared in over 24 films and television productions between the 1980s and 2010s, including Home Alone 2, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Sex and the City, and multiple episodes of his own reality competition show, The Apprentice, which ran for 14 seasons beginning in 2004. He also appeared briefly in a Ghosts of Girlfriends Past, a Woody Allen film, and various music videos. Many of the appearances were brief walkthroughs in which he played himself, often pointing at something or confirming directions. Trump was elected president in 2016 and served from 2017 to 2021, then won again in 2024. His entertainment portfolio remains, by any measure, the longest and most eclectic of any person to hold the office. 46. On Joe Biden and the Corvette in the garage. So here's the thing about Joe Biden. He is a genuine, lifelong car enthusiast, with a particular devotion to a 1967 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray that he has owned for decades. Biden has spoken about the car in interviews many times, describing it with visible affection as something his father helped him acquire early in his adult life. The Corvette became a minor political storyline when classified documents were found stored in Biden's Wilmington, Delaware garage in 2023, in the same space where the car was kept. Biden's response to the location question, that the garage was locked and the Corvette was also in there, struck some observers as prioritizing the car's safety above all else, which may or may not have been entirely intentional. Biden served as the 46th president from 2021 to 2025. The Corvette reportedly remains in excellent condition. Some loyalties outlast any term limit. 47. Back to basics. The president who walked to his own inauguration. Here's the thing about Thomas Jefferson's inauguration in 1801. He walked to it. Jefferson lived in a boarding house just a short distance from the Capitol and arrived at his own swearing-in ceremony on foot, without a carriage or military escort, surrounded by a small group of friends and supporters. He wore plain clothes. He shook hands instead of bowing, which had been the more formal custom. The whole approach was deliberate. Jefferson wanted to signal a departure from what he saw as the monarchical pomp of the previous administrations. He was inaugurated as the third president, and he wanted everyone in the room and on the street to understand immediately that something had shifted in tone. Jefferson returned to the boarding house for dinner afterward and reportedly had to wait for a seat because the table was full. The most powerful man in the new republic, waiting politely for a chair. Some statements do not require a speech. 48. The president who was also a sheriff. So here's the thing about Grover Cleveland's pre-presidential career. Before he became the 22nd president of the United States, he served as the sheriff of Erie County, New York, and in that role personally carried out 2 executions by hanging. Cleveland was the sheriff from 1871 to 1873, and when it came time for executions, he did not delegate the task to a deputy. He performed them himself, later explaining that he felt it was wrong to assign to someone else a duty that was legally his responsibility. The decision followed him into politics, where opponents occasionally raised it as a mark against his character. Cleveland consistently maintained that he had acted out of principle. He went on to serve as mayor of Buffalo, then governor of New York, then twice as president. Not many career trajectories passed through that particular combination of roles. Cleveland's life was, if nothing else, unusually direct about the weight of public duty. 49. The 2 presidents who died on the same day. Here's the thing about July 4th, 1826. 2 former presidents died on the exact same day, which happened to be the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, the second president, and Thomas Jefferson III both passed away on July the 4th, within hours of each other. Adams reportedly said near the end, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing that Jefferson had died earlier that same morning in Virginia. The 2 men had been close friends, then bitter political rivals, then reconciled correspondents in their old age, exchanging long, thoughtful letters about history, philosophy, and the nation they had helped create. Their simultaneous deaths on Independence Day struck contemporaries as something almost beyond coincidence. James Monroe, the 5th president, died on July 4th, 1831, exactly 5 years later. 3 of the first 5 presidents died on the nation's birthday. History at times has an almost theatrical sense of timing. 50. The president who never lived in Washington. So here's the thing about George Washington. Despite having the capital city named after him, he was the only president who never actually lived there. Washington was elected in 1789 and served 2 terms, but the capital during his presidency was first New York City and then Philadelphia. The District of Columbia was still being planned and constructed during his time in office. Washington did oversee much of the planning and design of the new capital himself, working closely with French-American engineer Pierre-Charles L'Enfant on its layout. He reviewed plans, approved decisions, and expressed opinions about the city that would bear his name. He died in 1799, just over a year before the government officially moved to Washington. His successor, John Adams, was the first president to live in the new capital. The man the city was named after never spent a single night there as president. If you are still awake and enjoying this quiet journey through history, consider subscribing. There are 100 chapters here, and every single one of them is true. 51. Abraham Lincoln and the wrestling record. Here's the thing about Abraham Lincoln before the presidency. He was an exceptionally skilled wrestler. Lincoln stood 6 feet 4 inches tall with unusually long arms and considerable physical strength developed through years of frontier labor. He competed in wrestling matches throughout his youth and young adulthood in Illinois, and reportedly lost only once in approximately 300 matches over his lifetime, according to historical accounts. Choi, the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, inducted him as an outstanding American in 1992, recognizing his documented wrestling history. Lincoln's physical strength was a genuine part of his reputation in the communities where he lived and worked. He could reportedly lift weights and move objects that most men could not manage. The image of Lincoln as a quiet, bookish president is not inaccurate. He was all of those things. But he was also someone who, in his earlier years, could walk into almost any room and be the most physically formidable person in it. Both things were true at once. 52. The president who kept a pet alligator. So here's the thing about John Quincy Adams. He allegedly kept a pet alligator in a White House bathroom for several weeks, a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette during an 1825 visit. The alligator was reportedly housed in the East Room bathroom, where Adams apparently found some amusement in the reactions of unsuspecting visitors who encountered it. Whether Adams genuinely enjoyed the arrangement or simply had not yet figured out a diplomatic way to rehome a large reptile gifted by a beloved French revolutionary hero is not entirely clear. What is documented is that Lafayette toured the U.S. extensively in 1824 and 1825, receiving extraordinary hospitality everywhere he went and leaving behind a variety of gifts. The alligator detail comes from accounts of the period rather than Adams' own diary, so historians treat it with mild caution. But the image of a president thoughtfully maintaining a live alligator in his bathroom as a matter of diplomatic courtesy is, regardless of your confidence level in the sourcing, an extraordinary one. 53. Shout. The president who was homeschooled by his mother. Here's the thing about James Garfield. He was largely educated at home by his mother, Eliza Garfield, a woman of remarkable determination who raised 4 children alone after her husband died when Garfield was less than 2 years old. Eliza was barely literate herself when she began, but she learned alongside her children and pushed them toward education with fierce consistency. Garfield went on to become a college president, a classics scholar, a Union Army general, and eventually the 20th president of the United States. He credited his mother extensively throughout his life, and she lived to see his inauguration in 1881, one of the few mothers in history to watch her child sworn in as president. Eliza sat on the inauguration platform, and Garfield kissed her before taking the oath. It is one of the more quietly moving moments in presidential history. A woman who taught herself to read, on watching her son become the most powerful person in the country. 54. The president who translated the New Testament. So here's the thing about John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams. He translated the New Testament from Greek into English as a personal intellectual exercise. Adams was fluent in multiple languages, including French, Dutch, German, and Latin, and he read Greek with enough proficiency to work through biblical text in the original. The translation was a private scholarly project rather than a publication intended for distribution, consistent with Adams' habit of pursuing intellectual challenges for their own sake. He also wrote poetry, kept a diary for over 60 years, and after leaving the presidency, served in the House of Representatives for 17 more years, the only former president to serve in Congress after leaving the White House. He died at his desk in the Capitol building in 1848 at 80 years old, having collapsed during a session and been carried to the speaker's room. He had spent his final day exactly where he apparently preferred to be, working. 55. Andrew Jackson and the giant block of cheese. Here's the thing about Andrew Jackson and a very large piece of cheese. In 1837, near the end of his presidency, Jackson received a gift of a cheddar cheese wheel weighing approximately 1,400 pounds from a New York dairy farmer. The cheese sat in the White House entrance hall for nearly 2 years. When Jackson finally decided to dispose of it, he opened the White House to the public and invited anyone who wanted some to come and take it. Thousands of people reportedly arrived. The cheese was consumed in approximately 2 hours. Accounts from the time suggest the smell lingered in the White House carpets and walls for weeks afterward. The event became known informally as the People's Cheese and is one of the more unusual social events in White House history. Jackson was known for his populist style of governance and genuine belief in direct public access to the presidency. The cheese distribution, chaotic and fragrant as it apparently was, fit his approach almost perfectly. 56. The president who won a lawsuit against a newspaper. So here's the thing about Theodore Roosevelt's libel case. In 1913, after leaving the presidency, Roosevelt sued a newspaper editor named George Newitt, who had printed that Roosevelt was habitually drunk. Roosevelt was many things, but a heavy drinker was not one of them, and he pursued the lawsuit with characteristic determination. He called witnesses, including former cabinet members, military officers, and close associates who testified to his abstemious habits. Newitt's attorney ultimately admitted there was no evidence to support the claim. Newitt retracted the statement in court. Roosevelt, having proved his point, asked the court for only 6 cents in damages, a deliberate choice signaling that he wanted vindication, not money. The judge awarded him exactly that, 6 cents. Roosevelt donated the coins to charity. 3. The case is remembered as a precise and elegant use of legal process to protect personal reputation without excess. Roosevelt was, by most accounts, exactly the kind of man who would consider 6 cents an entirely satisfying amount. 57. Woodrow Wilson and the first presidential voice recording. Here's the thing about Woodrow Wilson. He made some of the earliest surviving audio recordings of a sitting U.S. president. While recording technology existed in limited form before Wilson's presidency, his administration coincided with a period when recorded speech was becoming more practical and more preserved. Wilson's voice survives on recordings in a way that most earlier presidents' voices do not, giving historians and listeners a direct, immediate sense of his cadence and delivery. He was a gifted public speaker who had been a professor and university president before entering politics, and his speaking style reflected that background: careful, structured, and rhetorically precise. Wilson served as the 28th president from 1913 to 1921. He was responsible for the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission, and leading the U.S. through World War I. Hearing his actual voice across a distance of over a century is one of those quiet, strange gifts that recording technology occasionally provides. History suddenly stops being abstract. 58. So, the president with the most children. So, here's the thing about John Tyler. In addition to being the president nobody wanted, as we covered earlier, he also fathered more children than any other U.S. president. Tyler had 8 children with his first wife, Letitia, who died in 1842 while he was in office, the first lady to die in the White House. He then married Julia Gardner in 1844, becoming the first sitting president to marry while in office. So, Julia was 30 years younger than Tyler. They had 7 more children together. That brings Tyler's total to 15 children across 2 marriages, a presidential record that has never been challenged. His last child was born in 1860 when Tyler was 70 years old. Perhaps most remarkably, Tyler was born in 1790. Through a chain of late fatherhood across generations, living grandchildren of John Tyler were reportedly still alive as recently as the 21st century. Troy, a president from the 1790s with family connections reaching forward more than 200 years. The math is improbable. The records confirm it. 59. The president who read the Bible. Every day, here's the thing about John Adams. He read the Bible every single day for most of his adult life, not primarily as a religious observance, but as a form of literary and philosophical study. Adams was a voracious reader across genres. History, law, philosophy are a science. And he approached scripture with the same analytical attention he brought to everything else. He made notes in his books, argued with the text, and drew connections between biblical themes and classical philosophy. Adams was not an Orthodox Christian in the conventional sense. He leaned toward Unitarianism and was skeptical of supernatural claims. But he considered the Bible essential reading for any serious person. He read it in the same spirit he read Cicero and John Locke. So, Adams lived to 90 years old, making him the longest-lived president until Ronald Reagan surpassed him in 2001, and George H.W. Bush surpassed Reagan in 2018. A man who read everything, argued with everything, and lived long enough to have genuinely revised his thinking many times over. 60. James Monroe and the last founding father presidency. So here's the thing about James Monroe. He was the last U.S. president who had served as a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and the last president who could genuinely be considered a founding father by direct participation. Monroe had been wounded at the Battle of Trenton in 1776, crossing the Delaware River with Washington on that freezing December night. He carried a musket ball in his shoulder for the rest of his life. Decades later, he sat in the White House managing a nation that had grown from 13 fragile colonies into something genuinely continental. The distance between those two moments, a 19-year-old bleeding in the snow and a 60-year-old president overseeing a stable republic, is difficult to fully absorb. Monroe died on July 4th, 1831, the third president to die on Independence Day. He was the last direct living link between the Revolution and the presidency. When he was gone, that particular thread between the founding and the future finally, quietly closed. 60 facts in, and if you are still listening, something quiet and warm has probably settled over you by now. The blanket feels heavier. The room feels softer. That's exactly right. Let the words just wash over you. True, strange, gently fascinating. 60 presidents and secrets down. 40 more to go. You are doing beautifully. 61. John Tyler and the ship that changed everything. There is a moment in history that almost nobody talks about, and here's the thing about the USS Princeton. It nearly ended the Tyler presidency in the most sudden way imaginable. In February of 1844, Tyler boarded the warship for a celebratory cruise down the Potomac River with hundreds of guests, including cabinet members and Washington socialites. The ship's massive new cannon, nicknamed the Peacemaker, was fired twice as a demonstration to enthusiastic applause. On the third firing, it exploded. The blast killed 8 people, including the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Navy, standing just feet from Tyler. Tyler himself had gone below deck moments earlier to hear a toast and was not on deck when the explosion occurred. The timing was entirely coincidental. He emerged to a scene of chaos and grief. 2 of his cabinet members were gone in an instant. Tyler quietly continued his presidency, married Julia Gardner, whose father had also been killed in the blast, just months later. A man who stepped away at exactly the right moment for entirely ordinary reasons. 62. James K. Polk and the inaugural ball he skipped. So here's the thing about James K. Polk and dancing. He and his wife Sarah did not dance, and they made that plainly known. When Polk was inaugurated in 1845, he and Sarah attended the inaugural ball but did not participate in the dancing. Sarah Polk was a deeply religious woman who discouraged alcohol and dancing at White House functions, and Polk supported her fully. By most accounts, Polk did not particularly enjoy social events in general. He was methodical and serious in a way that made small talk feel like a waste of operational time. He preferred working. Accounts from the period suggest he sometimes left the inaugural ball early to return to the business of governing, while the celebration continued without him. Sarah Polk, meanwhile, was one of the more intellectually engaged first ladies of the 19th century. She read widely, followed legislation carefully, and served as something of an informal political advisor to her husband. They worked together with quiet efficiency. The dancing was simply never part of the arrangement. 63. On Zachary Taylor and the horse that grazed on the lawn. Here's the thing about Zachary Taylor's horse. The animal had earned something of a retirement, and Taylor made sure it got one. Old Whitey was Taylor's war horse, a pale gray mount that had carried him through the Mexican-American War and, become almost as recognizable to the public as Taylor himself. When Taylor moved into the White House, he brought old Whitey along and allowed the horse to graze freely on the White House lawn. Visitors quickly discovered that the horse was extraordinarily patient with attention, and tourists began pulling hairs from his tail as souvenirs. This happened often enough that White House staff reportedly had to keep an eye on him to prevent visitors from gradually removing his entire tail one strand at a time. Old Whitey outlived his owner. Taylor died in office in 1850, and the horse walked in his funeral procession, riderless, behind the coffin. It is one of those images from the 19th century that arrives quietly and then stays with you longer than expected. 64, Millard Fillmore, and the library that started from nothing. So here's the thing about Millard Fillmore and the White House Library. When Fillmore arrived at the Executive Mansion in 1850, there was essentially no organized book collection there at all. True, the building that housed the leader of the United States had remarkably few books for an institution of its stature. Fillmore and his wife Abigail, a former schoolteacher who placed enormous value on reading and education, worked to change that. Abigail Fillmore lobbied Congress for funds to establish a permanent White House library and oversaw its creation in the upstairs Oval Room. She selected the initial volumes herself and turned a largely empty room into a functional, well-stocked library. It was one of the more lasting and understated contributions any First Lady made to the physical character of the White House. Fillmore himself was largely self-educated. He'd grown up in poverty in upstate New York and taught himself law by reading. The library they built together was, in some sense, a monument to exactly that kind of determined self-improvement. 65. Are Franklin Pierce and the only president to use affirm instead of swear. Here's the thing about Franklin Pierce's inauguration in 1853. He did not use the word swear when taking the oath of office. Pierce chose to affirm rather than swear, making him the only U.S. president to use that specific alternative phrasing at his inauguration. The Constitution explicitly allows either option, acknowledging that some individuals have religious or personal objections to swearing oaths. Pierce's reasons were personal and tied to the profound grief surrounding him at the time. His young son Benjamin had been killed in a train accident just weeks before, and Pierce and his wife were still in deep mourning. Some historians suggest the choice reflected his emotional state and a complex relationship with faith during an extraordinarily painful period. He also chose not to place his hand on a Bible during the ceremony, instead using a law book. Pierce arrived at the presidency carrying more private grief than almost any inaugural ceremony had ever witnessed. The quiet deviation from tradition was, perhaps, the most honest thing he could offer that day. 66. James Buchanan and the letter he wrote every week. So, here's the thing about James Buchanan's correspondence habits. He was one of the most prolific letter writers of any U.S. president, maintaining regular written contact with an extraordinary range of people throughout his life and presidency. Buchanan had entered politics in the 1820s and served in various governmental roles for decades before finally reaching the presidency in 1857, accumulating friendships, alliances, and ongoing correspondences across nearly every level of American public life. He wrote carefully and at length, preserving relationships through the kind of sustained written attention that requires genuine discipline. His personal letters reveal a man more warm and thoughtful in private than his troubled presidency might suggest. Buchanan served during one of the most fractious periods in American history, the years immediately preceding the Civil War, and historians have debated his decisions during that period extensively. What is less debated is that he was attentive to the people he cared about, and that the letters he sent week after week for decades are a record of that care. 67. Abraham Lincoln and the letter he never sent. Here's the thing about Abraham Lincoln and a practice he developed during the Civil War. When he was furious with a general or official and needed to express it fully, He would write what historians now call a hot letter. He would compose the letter with complete honesty. All the frustration, all the disappointment, all the sharp edges, and then he would set it aside and never send it. Researchers discovered multiple such letters in Lincoln's papers after his death, marked in ways that indicated they were written for release rather than delivery. Lincoln understood that expressing anger fully and then choosing silence was more effective than either suppressing the feeling or actually sending the message. General George Meade received one of the most famous of these unsent letters after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, when Lincoln believed Meade had failed to pursue the retreating Confederate army. The letter was never delivered. Lincoln filed it away. The restraint that practice required is, in its own quiet way, remarkable. 68. Andrew Johnson and the tailor shop he kept thinking about. So, here's the thing about Andrew Johnson's relationship with his origins. Even as president, he reportedly kept the tools of his old tailoring trade nearby, and occasionally made or mended his own garments in the White House. Johnson had apprenticed as a tailor as a young boy in North Carolina after his father died, and his family fell into poverty. He eventually ran his own tailoring shop in Greenville, Tennessee, where he also began his political career. He met his wife Eliza there. She reportedly helped teach him to read and write with greater fluency, since his early schooling had been extremely limited. Johnson was proud of the craft and spoke about it openly throughout his political life, viewing it as evidence of self-sufficiency rather than something to move past. He was impeached by the House in 1868 over his conflict with Congress regarding Reconstruction policy and acquitted by a single Senate vote. The man who made clothes with his own hands came within one vote of losing the most powerful office in the country. That margin is worth sitting with quietly. 69. Ulysses S. Grant and the failed business years. Here's the thing about Ulysses S. Grant before the Civil War. He was, by most measures, not doing well. After resigning from the Army in 1854, Grant attempted farming in Missouri, sold firewood on street corners in St. Louis, and worked briefly as a bill collector and in his family's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. None of it went particularly well. He struggled financially, personally, and professionally for nearly a decade. Then the Civil War began, and Grant, who understood military command at a level very few people could match, rose from obscurity to lead Union forces to victory and eventually to the presidency. He served as the 18th president from 1869 to 1877. His pre-war years are a reminder that trajectories are not always visible from the middle. A man selling firewood in St. Louis in 1858 could not have known what 1865 would look like. History has a way of waiting quietly for the right set of circumstances to arrive. 70. Rutherford B. Hayes and the first Easter egg roll. So here's the thing about the White House Easter egg roll. It began under Rutherford B. Hayes in 1878, and it has continued with some interruptions ever since. The tradition of children rolling Easter eggs on the Capitol grounds had existed before Hayes, but Congress passed the Turf Protection Law in 1876, prohibiting the use of Capitol grounds for recreational activities. When children showed up on the Capitol lawn the following Easter and were turned away, Hayes reportedly invited them to use the White House grounds instead. The event became an annual tradition that has outlasted every administration since. Hayes served as the 19th president from 1877 to 1881, and is often overshadowed by more dramatic predecessors and successors. But he gave American children an annual spring tradition that has persisted for nearly 150 years, largely because one afternoon he looked at a group of disappointed children and found a sensible solution. That is quietly not nothing. 71. James Garfield and the math proof he could do in his head. Here's the thing about James Garfield's relationship with mathematics. In 1876, while serving as a member of Congress, he published an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem using a trapezoid. It was a genuine mathematical contribution, Not a reproduction of an existing proof, but a new approach that Garfield had worked out himself. He reportedly came up with it during a casual mathematical discussion with colleagues and found it elegant enough to submit for publication. It appeared in the New England Journal of Education and remains valid today. So, Garfield was the only U.S. president to have published an original mathematical proof. He was also, as previously noted, ambidextrous and fluent in classical languages. His intellectual range was extraordinary and might have defined his presidency had he lived to serve a full term. He was shot in July of 1881 and died in September. Garfield had been in office less than 7 months. The proof, at least, is permanent. Mathematics does not have a term limit. 72. Chester Arthur and the fishing trip that became national policy. So here's the thing about Chester Arthur and his approach to public land. He signed the Yellowstone Park Protection Act in 1883, which gave the federal government real enforcement authority to protect Yellowstone from poachers and developers who had been helping themselves to the park's resources since its establishment in 1872. Arthur had visited Yellowstone personally the same year, taking an extended fishing and camping trip through Wyoming territory that lasted several weeks. The trip involved mules, tents, and a large presidential party roughing it through genuinely wild terrain. Arthur was 53 years old at the time and reportedly suffering from the kidney disease that would eventually kill him in 1886. He fished, he camped, and he came back with a clearer sense of what the park needed. The legislation that followed gave rangers real authority to act. Arthur is not remembered as an environmental president, but his camping trip produced something that has protected one of America's great natural wonders for over a century. 73. Grover Cleveland and the Surgery Secret, revisited. Here's the thing that makes Cleveland's secret yacht surgery even more remarkable than we covered earlier. The cover story was maintained for over 2 decades through active effort. After the operation in 1893, a reporter named E.J. Edwards published an account in the Philadelphia Press suggesting Cleveland had undergone secret surgery. Cleveland's administration denied it completely and aggressively, calling the story false and damaging the reporter's credibility. Edwards was largely discredited by the denial, and his account was ignored by the broader press. The truth was not confirmed until 1917, when one of the surgeons, William Keene, published a first-person account of the procedure. Edwards was vindicated 24 years after the fact, long after it could do him any professional good. Cleveland had died in 1908. The surgeon's account confirmed every significant detail Edwards had originally reported. The lesson that story carries about who gets believed and why is one that has not aged particularly well, or particularly strangely, depending on how you look at it. 74. Benjamin Harrison and the voice that didn't match. So here's the thing about Benjamin Harrison's public speaking. His voice was reportedly warm, resonant, and genuinely compelling in large venues, which surprised nearly everyone who had met him in private. In person, Harrison was famously cold and stiff. He shook hands with people in a way that left them feeling they had gripped a fish, according to accounts from colleagues. He struggled with small talk. He did not do warmth in one-on-one settings, but when he stood in front of crowds, something shifted. The voice opened up, the delivery became assured, and audiences were often moved in ways they had not anticipated going in. His speeches during campaign tours were considered genuinely effective. Harrison was the 23rd president, serving from 1889 to 1893, grandson of William Henry Harrison, the president who gave that fatal 2-hour speech in the cold. Benjamin learned something from that, or perhaps just from his own constitution. He kept his speeches considerably shorter, and he always kept his coat on. 75. William McKinley and the open door policy. Had literally lived. Here's the thing about William McKinley's approach to the public. He took the term open door policy almost literally when it came to meeting ordinary Americans. McKinley held public receptions at the White House where anyone could essentially walk in and shake his hand. Ciao, and he was extraordinarily efficient at it. He developed a technique of gripping a visitor's hand first and quickly moving it aside to free himself for the next person, allowing him to receive hundreds of handshakes in a single session without his hand swelling. His record was reportedly over 2,500 handshakes in a single afternoon. He genuinely seemed to enjoy it. McKinley was known as one of the more personally warm presidents of the late 19th century, comfortable with crowds and with individuals in equal measure. The open reception style, however, also made him deeply accessible in ways that had no security filter. The exposure it created contributed directly to the circumstances of his assassination in 1901. Warmth in that particular case came at an extraordinary cost. 76. Theodore Roosevelt and the National Park Legacy. So, here's the thing about Theodore Roosevelt and conservation. During his presidency from 1901 to 1909, he protected approximately 230 million acres of public land through executive action. That includes 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird reservations, 4 national game preserves, and 150 national forests. The sheer scale of it is difficult to absorb as a single sentence. Roosevelt used the Antiquities Act of 1906, which he had helped push through Congress, to designate national monuments with executive authority alone, bypassing the slower legislative process. He moved quickly and deliberately, understanding that land not protected in his moment might not be available for protection later. Places like the Grand Canyon, Muir Woods, and Devil's Tower exist in their current preserved form, in significant part because of decisions Roosevelt made, sometimes over the objections of commercial interests. He was a complicated man across many dimensions, but the land he saved is still there, and you can walk on it. 77. William Howard Taft and the job he actually wanted. Here's the thing about William Howard Taft and the presidency. He reportedly did not particularly want it. Taft had long dreamed of serving on the Supreme Court, a position more aligned with his training as a lawyer and his careful, deliberate temperament. Theodore Roosevelt, his close friend and predecessor, pushed him toward the presidency instead, and Taft ran and won in 1908. He served one term and lost his re-election bid in 1912 in a 3-way race that split the Republican vote when Roosevelt ran against him as a third-party candidate. Then in 1921, President Warren Harding appointed Taft as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the position he had always wanted. Taft reportedly said it was the fulfillment of his life's ambition. He served as Chief Justice until shortly before his death in 1930. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, the only president and only Chief Justice interred there. He finally got the job that fit. It just took a presidency first to get there. 78. Woodrow Wilson and the invisible second term. So, here's the thing about the final stretch of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Much of it was conducted by people who were not Woodrow Wilson. In October of 1919, Wilson suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and largely incapacitated. For the remaining 17 months of his presidency, he was shielded from visitors, from the press, and from most of his cabinet by his wife, Edith Wilson, who controlled access to him and communicated his decisions, or decisions made on his behalf, to the outside world. Edith Wilson later described her role as a stewardship rather than a co-presidency, insisting she only relayed her husband's instructions. Historians continue to debate how much actual decision-making she exercised. What is documented is that the public and most of the government did not know the full extent of Wilson's condition. The country was administered through a carefully maintained appearance of normalcy. The president behind the curtain was, for much of that period, genuinely unreachable. 79. Warren G. Harding and the dog who had a better reputation. Here's the thing about Warren Harding's Airedale Terrier. The dog, named Laddie Boy, was arguably more beloved by the American public than any other White House pet before him, and Harding made sure of it. Laddie Boy had his own chair at cabinet meetings, a hand-carved wooden chair that Harding reportedly used as a light-hearted prop during photographs. The dog received fan mail. Newspapers covered his activities. On Laddie Boy's birthdays, Harding threw him parties with dog biscuit cakes made by neighborhood dogs owners. When Harding died in office in 1923, newsboys across the country donated their pennies to create a statue of Laddie Boy as a tribute. Sorry, the pennies were melted down and cast into a bronze statue that now lives in the Smithsonian Institution. Harding's presidency was damaged by serious corruption scandals, many of which emerged after his death. Laddie Boy's reputation, by contrast, remained completely spotless. Some members of any administration simply make better choices than others. 80. Calvin Coolidge and the Exotic Pet Collection. So, here's the thing about the Coolidge White House and animals. It contained an almost bewildering variety of creatures during his presidency from 1923 to 1929. The Coolidges had dogs, cats, birds, and a pet raccoon named Rebecca, who had originally been sent to the White House to be served at Thanksgiving dinner. Coolidge instead adopted her, built her a special house on the grounds, and walked her on a leash around the White House like a dog. There was also a pygmy hippopotamus named Billy, 2 lion cubs, a wallaby, a donkey named Ebenezer, and a bear at various points, most of them gifts from foreign dignitaries or admirers that the Coolidges accepted and kept, rather than declined or redirected. The White House during the Coolidge years was, in terms of its animal population, closer to a small zoo than an executive residence. Silent Cal, the most famously quiet and economical of presidents, had a house full of raccoons and lion cubs and apparently found this entirely unremarkable. 80 facts in, and the night has gotten very quiet around you by now. The words have probably started to soften at the edges. That warm, floating feeling where history and sleep start to gently overlap. That is exactly where you are supposed to be. 20 more chapters left. Each one true, each one strange, each one worth the last few minutes of your evening. Let your eyes rest. The words will carry you the rest of the way. 81. Herbert Hoover and the language nobody else spoke. There is a very specific kind of privacy that comes from speaking a language almost nobody around you understands. And here's the thing about Herbert and Lou Hoover. When they wanted to speak privately in public settings, including the White House, they conversed in Mandarin Chinese. Both had lived in China in the early 1900s, where Herbert worked as a mining engineer during a period that included the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. Lou had studied geology and was genuinely fluent. The couple used Mandarin conversationally throughout their marriage when they needed discretion, particularly around staff or visitors they did not want overhearing sensitive discussions. It was practical, elegant, and entirely unstudied as a strategy. They simply already knew the language and found it useful. Hoover served as the 31st president from 1929 to 1933. The Mandarin conversations are one of those quiet details that make a historical figure suddenly feel unexpectedly vivid and real. 82. Franklin D. Roosevelt and the stamps he loved more than most things. So, here's the thing about Franklin Roosevelt and stamp collecting. It was not a casual hobby, but a serious, lifelong pursuit that gave him genuine pleasure during some of the most difficult years any president has ever faced. Roosevelt had collected stamps since childhood and maintained an enormous collection throughout his life. He designed several U.S. postage stamps himself, submitting sketches to the post office with specific ideas about composition and subject matter. During his presidency, he would sometimes spend evenings with his albums while being briefed, handling stamps with tweezers and a magnifying glass while aides read him reports. Roosevelt served 4 terms, guiding the U.S. through the Great Depression and most of World War II. The stamp collection was where he went to feel something small and manageable in his hands. Given what he was carrying in those years, that seems not just understandable, but entirely human. 83. Harry Truman and the morning walk nobody could keep up with. Here's the thing about Harry Truman's morning walks. They were not gentle strolls. Truman walked at approximately 120 steps per minute, which is a brisk military pace that left Secret Service agents and reporters genuinely struggling to keep up. He walked every morning regardless of weather, covering roughly 1.5 miles at that speed, often before most of Washington had finished its first cup of coffee. He wore a suit and hat. He swung his arms. He did not slow down for questions. Truman had a deeply disciplined physical routine that coexisted with his late-night piano playing and his fondness for bourbon in moderate quantities. He was the 33rd president, serving from 1945 to 1953, and he brought to the office the same no-nonsense, our forward-moving energy he brought to every sidewalk. Keeping up with him, physically or politically, required genuine effort from almost everyone around him. 84. Dwight Eisenhower and the painting hobby he took seriously. So, here's the thing about Dwight Eisenhower and painting. He took it up in his late 50s on the suggestion of Winston Churchill, who was himself an accomplished amateur painter and became genuinely devoted to it. Eisenhower produced over 250 paintings during his lifetime, mostly landscapes and portraits, working in oil. He found the practice meditative and restorative in a way that golf, for all its pleasures, did not quite replicate. Several of his paintings were reproduced as greeting cards and prints. He gave them as gifts to friends, foreign leaders, and family members. Churchill and Eisenhower had painted together on at least one occasion, which is one of those historical footnotes that feels almost too charming to be true, but is thoroughly documented. Eisenhower was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe before becoming the 34th president. After commanding the largest military operation in history, he spent his quieter hours standing at an easel. That balance seems somehow entirely right. 85. John F. Kennedy and the rocking chair prescription. Here's the thing about John F. Kennedy and the rocking chair. It was not a style choice, but a medical one. Kennedy suffered from severe chronic back pain throughout his adult life, stemming from a combination of a football injury at Harvard, a wartime injury when his PT boat was rammed, and a congenital spinal condition. His doctors recommended rocking chairs as a way to keep him mobile and reduce pressure on his spine. Kennedy used them everywhere, in the Oval Office, on Air Force One, at his home in Hyannisport, and in various other locations. He became so associated with the image that the specific style of rocker he preferred, made by a North Carolina craftsman named Henry Kennedy, became commercially popular. He gave them as gifts to foreign leaders. Kennedy was the 35th president. The rocking chair is one of those objects that looks like an aesthetic signature, but was actually a quiet daily negotiation with pain. 86. Lyndon B. Johnson and the Beagles named him and her. So, here's the thing about Lyndon Johnson's Beagles. He named them him and her, which is either brilliantly simple or the least creative naming in presidential pet history, depending entirely on your perspective. The dogs were well-known White House residents during Johnson's presidency and appeared in numerous photographs and public events. In 1964, Johnson caused a significant public reaction when he lifted one of the Beagles by the ears during a public appearance on the White House lawn. The image was widely published, and the response was immediate and largely critical. Johnson expressed surprise at the reaction, suggesting it was something he had always done and that the dogs enjoyed it. The American Kennel Club and various animal welfare voices disagreed. Johnson was genuinely fond of the dogs and apparently had not anticipated the response. It became one of the more memorable moments of his public image. a president genuinely puzzled by the gap between his intentions and how they landed. 87. Richard Nixon and the music he composed. Here's the thing about Richard Nixon and music. He played 5 instruments, including piano, violin, accordion, clarinet, and saxophone, and he composed a piano concerto that was actually performed. Nixon had studied piano seriously as a child and maintained a genuine connection to music throughout his life. In 1960, he appeared on The Jack Paar Show and played a piece he had composed himself, describing it with characteristic seriousness as something he had written as a young man. The performance was well received. Nixon was the 37th president, serving from 1969 until his resignation in 1974. He is remembered primarily for Watergate and for the historic opening of diplomatic relations with China. The music is almost never mentioned, but it existed: 5 instruments, 1 original composition, a president who sat at a piano on a late-night television stage and played something he had made himself. That detail deserves at least this much room. 88. Gerald Ford and the 2 assassination attempts in 1 month. So here's the thing about September of 1975. Gerald Ford survived 2 separate assassination attempts within 17 days. The first occurred on September 5th in Sacramento, California, when a woman named Lynette Fromm pointed a gun at Ford in a public park. A Secret Service agent grabbed the weapon before it was fired. The second occurred on September 22nd in San Francisco, when a woman named Sarah Jane Moore fired a shot at Ford from across the street. A bystander deflected her arm and the bullet missed. Ford was unhurt in both incidents. He did not significantly alter his public schedule afterward, a decision that reflected either extraordinary composure or extraordinary stubbornness, depending on who you ask. Ford served as the 38th president from 1974 to 1977, having never been elected to either the presidency or vice presidency. He navigated a genuinely turbulent period with a steadiness that history has perhaps underappreciated. 89. Jimmy Carter and the nuclear submarine commander. Here's the thing about Jimmy Carter's military background. Before he was a peanut farmer, a governor, or a president, he was a naval officer selected by Admiral Hyman Rickover to work on the development of the early nuclear submarine program. Carter was one of the first officers assigned to the project and trained extensively in nuclear reactor technology. He was, by any measure, a serious scientist and engineer, not simply a serviceman. When a nuclear reactor at Chalk River in Canada partially melted down in 1952, Carter led a team that helped dismantle it, manually entering the reactor in short rotations to limit radiation exposure. He served as the 39th president from 1977 to 1981. After the presidency, he dedicated decades to humanitarian work, including Habitat for Humanity and international election monitoring. Carter died in December of 2024 at 100 years old, the longest-lived president in American history. 90. Ronald Reagan and the Secret Service code names. So here's the thing about Ronald Reagan's Secret Service code name. It was Rawhide, assigned during his presidency from 1981 to 1989, and it fit in a way that felt almost too on the nose for a former Hollywood actor who had played cowboys on screen. Secret Service code names are assigned for communication, efficiency, and security rather than symbolism, but the Reagan names have a particular poetry to them. Nancy Reagan's code name was Rainbow. The code names for presidential families are chosen from a consistent letter for ease of radio communication, meaning every member of the same administration's protected family shares a starting letter. Reagan survived an assassination attempt in March of 1981, just 69 days into his first term, when he was shot outside a Washington hotel. He recovered and served nearly 2 full terms. The codename Rawhide was used by agents in those tense radio communications on that afternoon. It is a small, strange detail that suddenly carries considerable weight. 91. George H.W. Bush and the parachute jump at 80. Here's the thing about George H.W. Bush and skydiving. He made his first parachute jump as a young Navy pilot during World War II, after his plane was shot down over the Pacific in 1944. He was 19 years old. To mark his 75th birthday, he jumped again. And his 80th, and his 85th, and his 90th. Bush made a total of several commemorative jumps in his later years, landing in fields in Maine and Texas to the visible delight of crowds and family. He had said after the wartime jump, which he made under extraordinary circumstances, unsure whether his parachute would open, that he wanted to prove to himself and others that fear did not have to be the last word on any experience. He kept proving it every 5 years, well into his 90s. That is a particular kind of stubbornness that is difficult not to admire. 92, on Bill Clinton and the Rhodes Scholar who almost studied something else. So, here's the thing about Bill Clinton's time at Oxford. He was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship in 1968 and studied at University College, Oxford, but he never completed a degree there. Clinton left Oxford after 2 years without finishing his course of study, returning to the U.S. to attend Yale Law School instead. He was nonetheless part of a remarkable cohort of Rhodes Scholars during that period, and used the Oxford years to read widely and develop the intellectual range that would define his later career. Clinton was the 42nd president, serving 2 full terms from 1993 to 2001. He had an extraordinary memory. Staff and colleagues frequently noted his ability to recall names, facts, and policy details with unusual precision, years after first encountering them. The Oxford years without the degree are one of those biographical details that feel mildly surprising until you realize that what Clinton absorbed there was never really about the credential. 93, George W. Bush and the painting series Nobody Expected. Here's the thing about George W. Bush's post-presidential life. He took up painting, and he was considerably better at it than most people expected. Bush began painting after leaving office in 2009, starting with pets and landscapes before moving to portraits. In 2014, a collection of his portraits of world leaders he had known as president was exhibited publicly. In 2017, he published a book of portraits of military veterans titled Portraits of Courage, with proceeds going to veteran support programs. Art critics offered measured assessments, serious enough to engage with, not masterworks, but genuine efforts by someone learning a craft with real dedication. Afterward were quieter business entirely. A former president in a studio in Texas, working at something new, improving steadily, mostly out of the spotlight. 94, Barack Obama and the book list that never stopped. So here's the thing about Barack Obama's reading habits. He maintained an active, public reading life throughout and after his presidency in a way that was genuinely unusual for a sitting head of state. Obama regularly shared book recommendations, published annual reading lists, and has spoken extensively about the role that fiction in particular played in his thinking about empathy, governance, and human complexity. He cited novels by Marilynne Robinson, Toni Morrison, and Colson Whitehead, among others, as having shaped his thinking in meaningful ways. He also interviewed Robinson for the New York Review of Books while still president, a sitting president conducting a literary interview as a serious intellectual exercise. Obama served 2 terms from 2009 to 2017. After leaving office, he and Michelle Obama signed a production deal with Netflix and a publishing deal that produced memoirs from both of them. The reading list, updated every year, keeps going. Some habits outlast every term limit. 95. Donald Trump and the tallest presidential tower. Here's the thing about Donald Trump and architecture. Before entering politics, he spent decades as one of the most recognizable real estate developers in the U.S., with his name attached to skyscrapers, hotels, casinos, and golf courses across the country and internationally. Trump Tower in New York City, completed in 1983, stands at 58 floors and became one of the most recognizable buildings on the Manhattan skyline. So, Trump lived in a penthouse at the top of the building for decades, including during the early months of his first presidency, when security arrangements around Trump Tower became an unprecedented logistical challenge for New York City. Trump was the 45th president, serving from 2017 to 2021, and won the presidency again in 2024, Sartre becoming the 47th president, the only person in U.S. history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms since Grover Cleveland. His name remains on buildings across multiple countries, an unusual kind of architectural legacy for a head of state. 96, Joe Biden and the longest-serving vice president. So here's the thing about Joe Biden's tenure as vice president. He served 8 full years under Barack Obama from 2009 to 2017. Sartre, one of the longest continuous vice presidential tenures in recent American history. Biden had previously run for president twice, in 1988 and 2008, before becoming Obama's running mate. He was first elected to the U.S. Senate from Delaware in 1972, at just 29 years old, making him one of the youngest senators ever elected, though he turned 30, the constitutional minimum age, before being sworn in. Biden served as the 46th president from 2021 to 2025. His political career spanned over 5 decades in federal office, from the Senate chambers of the early 1970s to the Oval Office in his late 70s. Few careers in American political history have covered that particular arc with that kind of continuity. 97, the president whose grandfather was also president. Here's the thing about Benjamin Harrison. He was the grandson of William Henry Harrison, the 9th president, making them the only grandfather-grandson pair to both hold the office in U.S. history. William Henry Harrison served 31 days before dying in 1841. Benjamin Harrison served a full term as the 23rd president from 1889 to 1893. The 2 men shared a name, a political party, and a state of Indiana as a home base, but their presidencies were separated by nearly half a century. Benjamin was 14 years old when his grandfather died in office. He grew up with a Harrison name carrying both legacy and weight in equal measure. He pursued law and military service before politics, serving as a Union Army brigadier general during the Civil War. The presidency his grandfather barely occupied, Benjamin inhabited fully. 2 men across 2 generations, shaped by the same name, arriving at the same house by very different roads. 98, the president who taught school before everything else. So here's the thing about Millard Fillmore's early career. Before he was a lawyer, a congressman, or a president, he was a school teacher. Fillmore taught at a small school in New York as a young man while simultaneously studying law, using the teaching income to fund his legal education. He was largely self-taught in the way that many ambitious young men of his era were, borrowing books, reading late, working during the day, and advancing through sheer persistence. Fillmore rose from extreme poverty in rural New York to become the 13th president of the United States, serving from 1850 to 1853 after Zachary Taylor's death in office. His presidency is most remembered for the Compromise of 1850 and its deeply controversial elements. But the image of a young man teaching children their letters in a rural schoolhouse, quietly working through law books by candlelight afterward, carries something worth noticing. The distance he traveled from that classroom to the White House was enormous by any measure. 99. The president who was a licensed bartender. Here's the thing about Abraham Lincoln and tavern licenses. Before his political career took shape, Lincoln co-owned a general store in New Salem, Illinois, and held a tavern license that legally permitted him to sell spirits. The license was issued in 1833, and listed Lincoln and his business partner, William Barry. The store itself was not a great success. It eventually failed, but the license is documented and genuine. Lincoln was 24 years old at the time, working through a series of occupations that also included postmaster, surveyor, and rail splitter before law and politics became his primary path. The tavern license is one of those historical details that lands differently depending on your expectations of the man. Lincoln would go on to preside over the bloodiest conflict in American history, deliver some of the most enduring speeches in the English language, and reshape the legal foundation of the country. He started briefly with a liquor license in rural Illinois. Every beginning is somebody's whole story at the time. 100. A George Washington and the farewell that was actually a warning. And here's the thing about George Washington's farewell address. It was never actually delivered as a speech. Washington published it in 1796 as a written letter addressed to the American people through newspapers, and it covered ground that felt, even then, strikingly prescient. He warned against excessive partisanship, cautioning that political factions could become more devoted to party than to country. He warned against permanent foreign alliances that could drag the nation into conflicts not its own. He warned against accumulating national debt beyond what one generation could reasonably repay. He warned against regional divisions that could fracture the unity the revolution had cost so dearly to build. Washington was 64 years old when he wrote it, tired and genuinely ready to go home to Mount Vernon. He died 3 years later in 1799. The address is read aloud in the U.S. Senate every year on his birthday, a tradition that has continued since 1862. The first president's last public words still being spoken aloud, over 200 years later. That is as good a place as any to let the history rest, and let you rest with it. So tonight, somewhere between the sheep grazing on Woodrow Wilson's White House lawn and Herbert Hoover whispering Mandarin Chinese across a dinner table full of unsuspecting guests, something true and quietly wonderful happened. You learned that the men who built, broke, argued over, and occasionally bewildered an entire nation were, underneath all of it, just people. People with badly fitted dentures and mechanical horses and coconut paperweights sitting on the most important desk in the country. People who rode to their own inaugurations on foot or filed UFO reports on Tuesday evenings in Georgia, or taught themselves to read in the same years they were teaching other people's children. 100 facts, 100 true things, all of them buried just shallow enough to find if you know where to look. Sleep well. The history will still be here in the morning.